I'm the first eldest child, and actually quite geeky lah. So as a bit of a nerd, I was a librarian when I was in school, because I like the barcode scanners in primary school. But then they very quickly told me that you need to be primary 6 before you can scan the barcodes. So never made it to primary 6 to be in the library, and then got recruited to athletics. So started to do some running, and I think that also actually led to my journey in CJ. I was a swimmer. It was very formative. And then fun fact, I was swimming captain, and I think honestly, because for me, we came from a rather humble family. Like my mom and dad were both working, so I rarely saw them. I was mostly raised by my helper and my grandparents. And so I think actually swimming was a way to help me cope with life's challenges, honestly. As a geeky student, I never knew this, but I was actually mildly dyslexic through my whole life in school. And actually in CJ, just rolling back a little bit, my GP teacher at the time was also my lit teacher, so I could do lit, but I couldn't do GP. Then my GP teacher was like, Audrey, what's wrong with you? So that's the context for which I struggled, in school. It was very, very difficult because I didn't have answers. I only became cognizant of my adult dyslexia much later as an adult. So actually for me, going to the US to study, going to Stanford University was not even in my horizon. I didn't even know that someone like me could go overseas to study, that I made it there. And I think what happened was I was in the middle of the global financial crisis, 08-09, when Lehman collapsed, and I was working with a high-tech startup at that time, and the company competed with Steve Jobs. So they developed FaceTime on their cell phone, and then they competed head-on with Steve Jobs. But subsequently, what happened was, because of the crisis, I realized that as a young person, I was not taught about money. And that was when the journey of entrepreneurship started. It was a work and study program. You would take classes in the university, and it was an entrepreneurship program. So you would innovate on a business idea, and then you would find a business idea that you would want to pilot. So actually, me and a couple of friends, we were a bit crazy at the time. I guess when you're students, you got nothing to lose. So you just try, right? And so we managed to secure funding as well, and we found our first customer, and then we came back to Singapore, we monetized some of the banks, so that ended up being the early journey. When we first started, it was actually a full-fledged gaming world for kids and parents. So when we first started, we thought that if you teach children at a young age, they would be able to take these lessons in financial well-being into their adulthood. So that was the thesis and the hypothesis. So we had a very small angel round from family and friends, and then we sort of monetized it at the banks. The banks started to subscribe from our product. And then, long story short, what it is today is we have also an institute. We educate adults, and the business has also evolved beyond kids and parents as well. It's when we first started the work. So how many iterations? I think got 4 or 5 reinvention already. I would say the second iteration was when we started to grow up the business, and we taught young adults. So we started doing work within the universities, the polys, and then we started to create modules for the universities. So that was iteration 2, just before COVID. So actually it's a turnaround story. I came back to the business to turn the business around, because it was a really tough time at that time for my then business partner. At that time, I'm just being very open, we had founder drift.
Okay.
So we fought a lot as young founders. Couldn't agree on the vision.
Nice.
So I let her run the business, and then I kept my shares, thank God. And then I went on to do some work in the region. So that was when I ended up, actually there's another photo. Yeah, I was actually, this one. I was actually in Indonesia for a consulting talk. And then I started to see people, like children, actually begging on my door in Indonesia. And I've never seen that in my life, coming from the US and Singapore. And so I realized that, something was happening, and that poverty was really real. We walked the slums at that time too, and I realized that people were children were not eating on the table, they didn't have food, there was trash that was burning all around. So I realized that at that time, this mission sort of was planted on my heart, and I felt, that I couldn't turn an eye. So then, together with some friends, we actually started an impact fund. And we were very, very early. We funded entrepreneurs in the region who were working on sustainable agriculture, sustainable education, healthcare, and that was on for almost like 3-4 years before I came back to Penang. So actually in 2025, in November, we did our inaugural Wealth Resilience Festival. So actually Jerome was one of our speakers at the festival as well. We were together with Gerald, my husband. He's been a big part of the turnaround story. We actually curated Singaporean brands to share their Singapore story. So that was one of the thrusts for SG60, and we also created what we call intergenerational conversations. So the institute is really meant to dialogue and bring families closer to the intergenerational transfer of wealth through education, through formation, through values transfer. One of the biggest things that we've uncovered is this concept called money narratives. So what are the scripts and stories and the belief systems that you hold around money? So for example, we had one of our users, for her, money is the source of all conflict. Money is evil. Because she saw her parents fight about money and they never had enough. And her parents would weaponize money so that she would never have enough allowance, so she was very independent. So for her, money equals avoidance. She doesn't let her bank account. She doesn't talk to her husband about money. And then when she found out about this concept of money narrative and the work that we were doing, it completely transformed and shifted her belief system internally. She realized it was tied to her childhood experience or trauma. That's why it shaped her worldview to act and decide and be in a certain way. So that was very powerful because suddenly it's your life is not dependent on your past. You can shape it for the present and the future. So when she started to transform her money narrative, she realized that, she can have a new life. So she started having conversations with her husband.
Right.
And so this is just one example. But another example is this particular entrepreneur I know, for him, he came from a fairly well-to-do family, but his money narrative to risk was very unleveled. It was disproportionate amount of risk, right? And then for him, he came from a family where mom and dad would save for him, but he wouldn't save necessarily on his own terms, right? So in a sense, financial independence was never really a concern, a consideration. Then risk actually caused a lot of difficulty within his financial planning. But when he came to the concept of money narrative and risk narrative, suddenly he was like, actually maybe I need to moderate my risk. So these belief systems that are so entrenched in us actually prevent us from living our most flourishing life, or maybe from really making money work for you, to remove the shackles so that you can then do something new, to invest, or save up, or self-care, because some people hoard money, right? The opposite extreme is they hoard, then they don't spend on themselves. Then money is actually, you're enslaved to money because you can't even spare the money to do what you love for yourself or take care of. Yeah, and it's very interesting because we were just on a call with a friend, and she works with very wealthy families around the world. And you know what she found? She found that it was the Western families who brought the children into the discussion of wealth and finance very early on. But in Asian culture, we don't really talk to our kids or our spouse about money. Right? These are tough conversations. So actually, communication, the culture of communication and the culture of money, or the language of money, is actually something that we need to train and form. Right? I'll give you an example, right? I was speaking to this lady who's been married for a while, and then we were recently doing some work with her. And she said, I wish I actually invested more intentionally with my husband when I was younger. Because her money is her money, her husband's money is their money. So actually we have this concept called a family bank. It's actually started by James Hughes. It's actually one of the attorneys in the US in the family wealth space. He's 80 years old. He talks about how actually families can set aside a family bank. They pool money together and then they can do things together. They can give to causes they care about, or they can actually give startup funding to the children to do small businesses, right? So actually this concept of a family bank requires communication. It requires culture building within the family. but you need to talk now. But we are in a culture where we don't talk about money. It's tough, right? It's secrecy. So we need to unwind some of these things, especially the young people. Because if our parents don't talk to us about money, then where do we go? TikTok, YouTube. Also being cognizant of where the sources are and what these narratives and dominant narratives are. So we have to also fact check and I think what I've learned over the years is that the best experiences are lived. Right, because if someone tells you theory but you actually haven't experienced it, or someone hasn't really experienced it themselves, then actually it's not a practitioner's viewpoint, it's actually a theoretical viewpoint. So actually all of us have a lot of wisdom, and actually I realized that biggest wisdom sometimes are the failures, but not to do with your money. When I grew up in the environment, it was like money is security. Right, so I forged an independence to then find security, but I realized that actually that narrative was not very healthy lah. Once you have money, then you cannot spend. Then you can get secure in different things, right? So over the years, it's evolved. Where today, I think the narrative is money is a tool for a flourishing life. And so then it makes me question, right? Like, what's money for? And if money is a tool for a flourishing life, then I have to define what flourishing means for me and my family.